Hey, hello, I'm Ren Ribeiro, and I want to connect with you about peace and justice. We are interviewing women who labor for peace, as we have forever and always will, until we all feel peace in our homes, our workplaces, our communities, and especially our bodies and minds. This initiative is named Mujeres Co-Labor for Peace. It's a show of intimate conversations with justice workers who are healing their self and communities from the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. Welcome to the show. I am Ren Ribeiro, and I wish you complete wellness and lasting peace. Today's episode is MC4P's 18th, which feels like a big number, in part because we have another big topic in store: equity for women in science. Dr. Cassidy Sugimoto, the author of a transformational book named Equity for Women in Science, joins me for an intimate conversation on the numbers and the narrative about systemic obstacles keeping women's research from reaching equity, even if it might be nearing parity in some spaces. Professor Sugimoto educates students at the Georgia Institute of Technology about public policy. She is the president of the International Society for Scientometrics and Informetrics and is past program director at the National Science Foundation. First, let's start this episode with a check-in on our heart. My heart is feeling really jazzed up and inspired. How is your heart? And let's take a deep breath to appreciate our hearts.
Hello, hello.
Hi, Cassidy.
How are you, Ren?
I'm really glad that you're here. It's been, I think, a couple of months, and I'm so excited to talk with you. Welcome, Cassidy, to Mujeres Co-Labor for Peace. We met just a couple of months ago when you were touring with your fantastic book at UMass Amherst. I'm so glad that I was able to see you speak, and actually have a little statistic here that you said it will take we will not have gender parity in mathematics until the year 2147, 123 years from now. We'll get into all these amazing statistics that you have in this book after I read this. This is the book I've always wanted, full of statistics, anecdotes, and evidence-based suggestions that will transform the way the world understands the underrepresentation of women in science, by Jess Wade. So I love that.
And just a plug for Jess, fantastic work in amplifying the representation of women on Wikipedia. So very grateful for all the work that she does.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So one of the things we do, one of the main things we do when we start MC4P episodes is we do a heart check-in. So a quick question for you. How is your heart in this moment?
My heart is amazing. I was in Rwanda this weekend and I absolutely fell in love with the country. And it was one of those moments that's really allows you to connect and think about how we participate as global citizens. And so I'm just so grateful for the hospitality of that country, the incredible vistas, people, food, culture that I was able to experience. So my heart is full.
Wow, that's gorgeous. Thanks for sharing that. Mm. So feel free to pause and take a deep breath any moment that you would like to during this show. This is what we do. Try to do anyway. I tend to speak fast and forget to breathe. So let's do that when needed. Let's say the first question I think I want to begin with is going back to that parity one. You also shared, I remember you talking about Ruth Hubbard as one of your favorite heroes, or, you probably have tons of female heroes at the moment.
I do.
Yeah. So anything you want to say about that gender parity or Ruth Hubbard to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things that we often talk about is the parity versus equity issue here. I think it is very common for people to look at any inequality, whether it's about gender or other kinds of issues, and say, if only we could hit parity. So for gender inequality, we say if we just hit 50-50, everything would be good, everything would be fine. And what we find is that in many countries where you are almost hitting parity in the scientific workforce, things are not all good. And what we mean by that is it often means science is where there is no power. Science is a place that is underfunded, under-resourced. It is a war-torn country where most of the men have either died in war or they have left for better resources, where women are left behind because of both domestic care responsibility, both elder care and child care. They are the ones left to do science. So in many of those cases, what we're not seeing are success stories of where you're elevating women up and you're engaging them in scientific work, but the country is so resource depleted that they turn to women to engage in scientific work. And so what we often talk about is when you're thinking about parity, it's one step. We definitely go with the numbers, you count the numbers, but just because your numbers look good doesn't mean that the culture and the context in which scientific work is done is a place that is thriving, that is hospitable, that is equitable in every one of those cases. And so that's one of the things that we try to think about in that sort of parity and equity divide. The other thing, going to Ruth Hubbard, is looking not only just at the numbers, but the context in which science is done and the questions that are asked. And so what I loved about her quote that I shared in that event was she said, it's not just enough that women are doing science. Are they actually the ones asking the questions? Are they formulating the questions science asks? Are they asking them? Are they able to share the results that they find? And I think what she was reflecting on is a century long where we had women working in science, but often subjugated to certain roles, usually technical roles. So they were acting as computers. They were actually doing the calculation of science, which is amazing. And I celebrate all of those women who worked in that way, but they weren't able to say, I have an interesting question and I want to get the answer to it, and I want to share that answer with the world. And so that fundamentally changes what knowledge is created. And I think that's a huge statement, is when we're not just getting to parity, oh, we have enough women, but women are all in junior roles or in technical roles and not able to formulate the question. That's a very different environment. And I think it creates a different knowledge space that we are all, as citizens of the world, living in.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you explain really brilliantly in this book, excuse me, it's a little upside down, the world at the moment. You explain the Matilda effect and you share so many wonderful examples. I wonder if you might want to go into a little bit of what that is and kind of what is being done to overcome that currently that you're seeing.
Absolutely. So I'll introduce two concepts. The first was the Matthew effect, and that's drawn from the Bible. To him that hath shall more be given. And it was this idea of cumulative advantage, that once you win an award or recognition or a prize in any field or sector, then you tend to be able to get the next one easier and easier. And it becomes this cascading effect where people who are successful garner success even faster and faster, and then consume a lot of the resources of that field. So for science, we absolutely see that. The concentration of resources is with very few people. So we call it the Pareto law. You have 80% of the resources going to 20% of the people, 80% of the most elite publications going to 20% of the scholars. And it just continues to sort of aggregate and consolidate around certain key individuals who then are able to escalate in science and get more.
That's so interesting that I'm not a scientist, and I know the 80-20 rule in so many dimensions of my life in sales and whatnot. And it's called the Pareto effect. And I am really grateful for the context. You do context so well. Thank you.
Thanks, Red. So it was actually the individual who coined the Matthew effect in science studies was a man called Robert K. Merton. He was a sociologist, and his wife, Harriet Zuckerman, started studying Nobel laureates. And she started thinking actually about not just the Matthew effect, and she was the one who suggested it to Robert, but also thinking about the Matilda effect. And she drew it from another scholar who said, we need to think about cumulative disadvantage. If you're going up for a competition and you lose that competition, the probability that you then are continually devalued happens again and again. And when you start looking at women and underrepresented scientists, you see this happen all the time. So because you didn't get the position at the elite institution, your probability of getting in the highest publication, of getting more resources, you just get into this cycle of disadvantage where then you don't have the resume to suggest itself. So even though you may have a publication that is equally valid, selection for a publication or for grant funding is going to go to the person who already has the elite institution attached to their name, who already has the other funding thing attached to their name. And so you see this sort of space of systemic devaluation of women's work and other minoritized scholars in science. So that's what we call the Matilda effect, is effectively getting into that space of cumulative disadvantage.
Oh, so I think of Matilda Gage. Oh, tell me her whole name.
Yes.
She's 3 names. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, right? As a feminist, because I went to the 200th celebration of, it was 200, 100. Oh my gosh, 100 in 2020. I went to the celebration of the women's vote and learned about her. And so I was thinking it was a good thing partly because when I read through about the Gage database that's been created and the work that has been done, you mentioned Betsy Metcalf inventing the straw bonnet and Catherine Littlefield Green inventing the cotton gin, for whom and I learned this through Catherine Eden's work in The Injustice of Place. It's an amazing book. I learned that Eli Whitney did not invent the cotton gin. And there was another, Anne Harned Manning perfected the mower reaper. So I was like all excited about these women. And I kind of read it in conjunction with the Matilda effect. So I apologize for having it wrong in my head, and thank you for correcting.
No, you're right it's eponymous for Gage. So Margaret Rossiter, the one who coined the Matilda effect, she did it in honor of Gage. And it's really all of the women scientists who receive less or no credit for the work that they do because of their status, because of these other spaces. So it really started out with Gage, but in more to recognize under recognition than the opposite.
I see. Wow. Yeah. And so one of the other beautiful things that you do in this wonderful book, Equity for Women in Science, it doesn't look so beautiful on my screen, is you incorporate women's real lives, like not only through the narrative about their trials and tribulations and being co-opted by men and imitated, like the imitations, like you just mentioned, where the husband gets credit for something that the wife suggests. How many thousands of years did that happen? But you incorporate like real world situations with child rearing and reproductive labor and, housekeeping, whatnot, and you weave the qualitative and the quantitative together in such a profound, important way for people to access the information and to use it. What are some of the successes that you're seeing with the book? And like, has it really, what's the next step with it? Like, what are you continuing to do to get the word out there and to galvanize the work that you've done?
There are a lot of questions in there, so I'll try to answer all of
Sorry.
them. No, it's great. Well, so one thing I'll say is this, the power of the quantitative, and then I'll come back to the importance of the narrative. It was striking to me when we went out to give talks about this book before it was a book, when it was our various research projects, and we would present usually to academic administrators or journal publishers or professional organizations, and we're showing this data. And I would have more than once, I had people come up to me afterward and would say, oh, I've had to sit through all of these horrible DEI sessions telling me what to do, but I've said, well, I have women in my lab, I see them here, so obviously it's not a problem. And then they'd say, your talk had error bars. So I believe you. I trust you. You're credible to me. And the amount of people who came up to me who openly admitted to being dismissive, entirely dismissive that there was any inequality in science vis-a-vis women, they suddenly said, now I believe you. What can I do? Like,
Mm,
how can I, as a PI, change what I'm doing? Because now I believe you. I needed the numbers. And so it was part of that speaking someone else's language, right? These were scientists. They were only going to be convinced by data. They were not going to be convinced by anecdote. They were not going to be convinced by narrative. They wanted to see the data. And
mhm,
seeing the data at that macro level scale was really persuasive for them, because that was the other thing. They'd say, oh, well, maybe that's that case, but it's not the case in chemistry, or it's not the case in Croatia. And once you can show it's the case in chemistry, it's in the case in chemistry in Croatia, they say, okay, this is irrefutable, right? Now I'm willing to do something, because these people were not anti-change. They just didn't see that there was a problem that needed fixing. And so the power of the quantitative was really important. But then when we went to write a book, we said, I don't want this to be a technical report that's full of tables and is just the quantitative, because then people won't read it, right? And we
mhm,
want people to read it. We want people to sit down, and we want them to also understand that this is not just a slice in time, because that's the problem when you run any of these quantitative analyses. Then you cut that data, it's a moment in time, and then people can dismiss it saying, well, maybe that was last year or 5 years ago. This is not a
mhm,
situation anymore. So what we wanted to show and make a compelling argument for is that we have been dealing with these things for centuries. There are threads of this that are coming through, and there are going to be threads that will continue. Society creates hierarchies and inequalities. It does that. We have to be vigilant in order to avoid that. So I want you to hear this narrative and this story, so that if you're reading this in a year or in 5 years from now, you'll say, how are we perpetuating some of these same things? Maybe the numbers are a bit different, but these stories, these threads come through. So we really wanted to reach that accessibility. Those stories were the hardest part of the book and the most rewarding for me. To
mhm.
create 3 stories for each chapter, I read through dozens and dozens of stories of women's lives, and it was such a privilege to be able to have that time to listen to the stories and hear them. It's disheartening sometimes to think about how much is still the same, even though we've progressed. But then you also hear the success stories and you see that we have progressed, we are progressing, things are getting better.
Mhm.
So that's sort of how the book came together, in that sort of bizarre fashion of both narrative, but also the numbers. I'm really excited about the reception of the book. I think people are reading it. They're saying, I'm going to give this to my chair or my provost or my president or my funding agency. And then people are responding, because either the stories are compelling to them or the numbers are compelling to them. So we're getting both of those things. What I hope is that people take the last tables of actionable items for each actor group, and they take those and they do something with it. When I actually talked to the publisher, I asked if we could print it out like with perforation so people to rip it out of the book.
Interesting.
And I
Interesting.
think Harvard found that a little sacrilegious, but I was like, I want you to rip this out. I want you to put it on your back wall and like, am I doing these things? Whether I'm a science communicator, I'm a scientist, I am a journal editor, I am a university administrator. Am I doing the things in my category? Because science is such a unique an amazing ecosystem in that it's self-organized. We are the reviewers and the editors and the funders. Like, we are all working together in this major ecosystem, and we can't just keep pointing and saying, well, gender inequality is the problem of the administrator or the funder, or it's
Right.
all of us. It's all of us acting
Yeah.
together. And so we each have actions that we can take that will have a demonstrable difference in the future.
Wow, I'm going so many directions in my mind because not only like so I want to get to the list of incredibly practical summaries of hiring, promotion, tenure, and evaluation actions that universities can take to foster equity and cultures of inclusivity. But before I do that, I want to just like reflect on what what's coming up for me in terms of like if I were in academia, I could see myself doing a lot of finger pointing based on who I think is upholding the policing and enforcing of patriarchy the most. So
Mhm.
I wonder how what you say to people when to convince them or expand perspective around the fact that it's not a few bad apples, it's the air we breathe, it's everything, so how do you engage on that?
For me, I start from a frankly humble and slightly humiliating space that I've done the same things. I have perpetuating some of these things in my own lab. I look around my lab, and when we started doing this work, I suddenly realized that the first authors and the people who I had sort of encouraged and supported in generating their own ideas and writing and going to the elite journals were some of my male students who were born in the US, had a high command of English, and some of the people working in technical areas were my women, often who were foreign born. And I asked myself, how did I get to that spot? Right? This is what I study and I think about. But I was responding to the spaces. A student would come up and say, I really want to do this project. Can I do this? I'm like, yeah, go do it. Any of the students who would have come up to me to say that, I would have equally supported. But it never occurred to me that I need to actively cultivate this. I need to encourage one of my students for whom English is not their foreign language, who's not used to going up to a professor and stating what their priority is. I need to teach them that that's okay. I need to cultivate that. I need to elevate them up into the first author position. I need to ask them what questions interest them. I'm not doing that as a mentor. And so that was really kind of a hard lesson for me to learn as someone who studies and thinks about this, how much I was feeding into that same sort of system that we were there, just slowing down, taking the time to mentor better, to mentor equitably, right? Not just in a passive, receptive way, but to actively be encouraging equity is a lot of work. But it's work that we really need to do. So I try to share my own experience with people to say, start with your own mentoring, start with your own collaborations and the teams that you're building. What are you doing? Then look at yourself as a reviewer, as an evaluator. Most people who are active in science are doing reviews themselves. Are you letting institutional names sway your perception of credibility? Are you letting seniority sway your question of credibility? Like, what other things are you letting come into play when you're evaluating things? Like, really check yourself on that. And those make huge difference. And I mean, you say you're not in science, but what you're doing on this podcast right now is generating a conversation, who you invite, what questions you ask them, how you treat different people on your channel. We see so much in science communication of the way in which women's work and women scientists are displayed, the kinds of questions that they're asked, the kind of their work that is of interest, right? All of those things change how the world views women scientists and the culture that we create for them.
Yeah, beautiful. Wow. So that's so heartening. I can imagine the circles and the discussions and the healing and all of that, because this podcast is based on the 3 tenets of healing the effects of not just misogyny, but also capitalism and climate change. And I'm coming to, like, this is getting to the end of the first season, this inaugural season. And I'm feeling like if we heal misogyny in ourselves, all of us, it's a big,
All
huge
of us.
shift, and capitalism, and work toward solidarity economies and other so many different types of economies in ecosystems, then climate will clearly take care of herself. That's not something we just need to heal how we feel about it and kind of work toward cultivating that action, that hope in action. So next season will probably have a very different tone. And I think there's this desire in me to curate like the circles of circles, something like that. That may feed into this question about that list that you have in the back of the book. What of these types of all these recommendations that you make, what are the most meaningful to you or your favorite?
That's an interesting question. I'll sort of answer it in 2 ways, which sound really contradictory, but I think they're important. The first is spheres of influence, and then sort of second is dare to be different. So I think the first one is, what is your sphere of influence? I think that's a really beautiful moment of empowerment when we realize we each, as individuals, do have the capacity to change the world. Like, we really do, each one of us. And so realizing that and saying, what do I have influence over in my daily life every day? What could I do that would improve this? And I think every person who's rotating in that scientific ecosystem does have a lot more capacity to make a difference than they believe. So all of those lists are things that you can do. It's quite easy for you to do as an individual. You don't have to change the system to actually do those things. They're things you can do tomorrow. So I think that's really important. The
Mm.
second one, though, is the more radical thing. It's like, do something innovative, right? Really think up of a systemic and change your infrastructure, change your system, do something radical and be prepared to fail. It may not work, but we need some massive disruptions to our current system. This incremental change is not getting us where we need to be fast enough. So that statistic you provided at the beginning of the podcast, that hurts me, right? That's what incremental change looks like. And I don't have 123 years or so to wait for that change to occur. I have two daughters. They're living in the world right now in the way that it is. I don't want that world for them. I want a better world for it. And I think we need to accelerate change. To do that, it can't be incremental. It has to be disruptive. And disruptive change sometimes fails, right? We have to try things and we don't know how they're going to work. We're operating under uncertainty. And so I would challenge people to say, if you are in a position of power, what can you radically change about the system that you're governing? What kinds of things can we try that are different? And then can we test them, see if they worked, or if they're effective, and move on? And so we have countries that are trying different quota systems, for example, which are pretty radical to just say, for the next 3 years, we're only going to hire women. What does that look like? What are the consequences of that? Is it good, bad, otherwise? Institutions saying, you know what? We're going to start paying for childcare and we're going to put that in our fund. It's something we weren't able to do before, but we're now going to do it. We're going to assume that a scientist has children instead of assuming that they do not.
Yes, beautiful.
Right? What does that look like, right? Like, what would a university look like if you assume that the ideal scientist is a single woman with children? What does that look like? Like, what
Revolutionary.
kinds of just like basic universal things do you have to provide if you do that? Because we've created a system in which we assume the ideal scientist is someone who has a partner who doesn't work or has a more flexible work schedule and has children. That's a very different environment you're creating. So I just would like to see people make some of those radical shifts and assumptions on what it takes to be a scientist.
Wow, I love that so much. It's reminding me of a statistic that I quoted in a book that I wrote called Beyond Karen, Emerging from the Depths of an Epic Epithet. It's got a cover of a woman, naked woman coming out of a well. It was just in the title of the painting on the cover that I used is amazing. But in the book, I wrote something about the statistic I heard on the National Institute of Health did science on men and applied it to the health care for everyone up until 2016. Is that accurate? I mean,
It is. And
it's crazy.
it depends on the year, but 7 to 8 out of 10 drugs withdrawn from the market are withdrawn because they have adverse health effects on women, because they did not take sex into account when they were testing for those pharmaceuticals. So we still, even after policies that are saying you have to take sex into account and you have to test both sexes, we still tend to not do that in certain areas like pharmacology. So we are creating mass medication for our society that hasn't been tested on us. And you can say, okay, well, but if you're doing, biomedical sciences and you're only looking at the cellular level, maybe it doesn't matter, but we find it really does. Cells derived from male mammals versus female mammals have different responses to stressors, different absorption of lipids. The way that they're responding is fundamentally different. And we're not taking that into account when we're doing our biomedical scientists. And that hurts women, right? It's a direct adverse effect for women. So
physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially, on so many levels, right?
Everything. No, so it's really hard. I will say, just as a quick side note on that, which I find very interesting, is a lot of the reason that they have tried to protect women from being subjects in health and clinic trials is the idea that, women are very volatile, right? They're so volatile that if we were doing tests, we wouldn't be able to get an accurate prediction, because if you're close to your period, if you're going through menopause, all of these things are going to have higher volatility.
Just a hot mess.
There's several studies showing that males actually have higher volatility for the kinds of things that they're studying than women do. But because we are only looking at that manifestation of the hormonal variability, we're not looking at other forms of variability, which also have to be taken into account if you're using a male mouse model instead of a female mouse model. So just to say, this kind of mythology of women's heightened volatility may not be as accurate as we think it is.
Thank you. Is it in here or did I miss it? Like,
That's not in there, but there's another paper I can send you.
fantastic. I could just like consume everything that you write. One of the things that I loved, speaking of the national institutes, or the National Science Foundation Awards, analyzing this by gender, the funding of 430,204 awards, which was over $177 billion between the years of 1980 and 2020. Crazy, like 18.2% went to women, over 71% went to men. Canada, very similar, but a little bit better, where 360 awards over 39 billion in Canadian dollars were a little more equitably distributed, with almost 26% going to women and the 67% going to men. What? What are we doing to progress that?
I know. So that is something that concerns me a lot. Resources are at the heart of scientific production, and many fields are very resource intensive. Simply put, if you do not receive the resources necessary to do science, you'll leave science. So for any hard science discipline, that you're going to see that happen more often, that people don't land that big grant, they leave science. One of the most sobering articles that I've read, it's not my own research, others that have looked at the National Institutes of Health, found that African American and Black authors of proposals were funded at a significantly lower rate. And what they found the reason is because they were applying to the areas of the NIH which were heavily underfunded. So usually those that had more of a social application to them. So they were overfunding in the sort of basic biomedical sciences, which had a disproportionate number of white applicants. And so you saw this space of coming that they said, well, it's not really discrimination on race, it's about the correlation between race and topic and the space there. And I think it's a really interesting reminder that who you are changes what you're going to study. And so it's not just about saying every panel, we're going to make sure that we have, equal representation or representational sort of coverage of this, but really saying, are we creating a topic portfolio that matches the kinds of questions that a diverse portfolio of scientists are interested in? So it's not just to that level, again, of the parity thing, of just seeing the numbers, of saying, well, for this panel, there were 30% women authors and 30% of them got funded. It's really not about that. It's saying, how are we thinking about how we're creating the portfolio? And are these the kinds of topics that women are investigating, that African American women are investigating? Are we making sure that we're reflecting a topic portfolio that's consistent with the nation and consistent with the entire population of scientists, which right now we are not. Our portfolio at all funding agencies tends to replicate that which is a traditionally white male topical space. And we see the same things at higher ed institutions. So a recent study that we did looked across higher ed institutions, those that are ranked in US News and World Report in the sort of top 10% and the next echelons. And then we looked at the topic portfolio of authors by the intersection of their race and their gender. And we found that even when you changed the demographic composition of those institutions, even when they had a higher representation of, for example, Black female authors than you would expect, still they reflected a portfolio that was almost identical with the white male author portfolio, which means that you're only going to hire a Black woman if her topic looks like the white male topics that have come before, if they've assimilated into that topical space. So I think we really need to think, both from our higher ed institutions, but also funding organizations, what are we saying is valuable research? What are we saying are valuable topics to study? Because that in and of itself does a lot to increase the representation of different populations, of saying the topic that you care about, the topic that may affect your identity group, we also care about that topic. And right now we're not doing that in the United States.
Revolutionary. Like, seriously, this is democracy, right? This is the essence of democracy. If the funding represented the needs of the people, we wouldn't have, number one, we wouldn't have 140 million people in this state of poverty, according to the Poor People's Campaign. And those numbers would be reflected accordingly. And I just, am so again grateful for your work and for the networking that I can imagine it creating, the ripple effects. It's that one raindrop raises the ocean kind of Dinotopia image that comes to my mind about that. So again, thank you, thank you. I think I want to go to this next question here. Just getting a little bit more nuanced about women, maybe an anecdote or two about women researchers who are pushing back, supporting each other, and getting the recognition they deserve. Of the many, feel free to say as many as you like.
Oh my gosh, this is such a hard question because I feel so uplifted by all the women scientists in my life, and so it's hard to not go close to home. I mean, I was really grateful for my former dean. Now she's on rotation. She's going to be taking up a position as director of the social, behavioral, and economic sciences of the National Science Foundation. Kaye Husband's Feeling. She is amazing, and she has mentored me so much throughout my career in ways probably that I don't even know, but she has been there to lift me up, and I've seen her lift up other women scientists as well. And so I'm really grateful that she's taking that leadership role at the National Science Foundation, because I think that she will have the ability, again, as we talked about, that sphere of influence. Her sphere of influence now is huge in what she can do to support equity in the scientific community, which she has been doing relentlessly since she started her career. So I'm so grateful for her and all the work that she's done. We talked at the beginning about this, about Jess Wade, who wrote on the back of the book, really just doing the work, saying, what can I do? Well, I can write a Wikipedia article about a women scientist to elevate them. And I may never have met them. I know nothing about them, but I'm just going to lift them up. And then I'm going to bring other people together, because if 100 people write 5 articles, suddenly the representation of women on Wikipedia goes up and up and up. And so I think we all are doing things within our sphere of influence, whether it's mentoring the people directly below you, taking on leadership positions like at the National Science Foundation where you can do it, or just saying, hey, there's this problem that I can solve, right? Whether it's Wikipedia or otherwise. So too many women to name here that I'm afraid I would leave them out, but I will say, from the people I know to the people I don't, I'm grateful for everyone who's doing work in this area.
Yeah. And I do little things like only read women authors and make sure that I look for women directors in the films that I consume. And I've done that for many years now, and it makes a difference in the way that I feel connected, even in my mind, and just knowing stories about women. It nourishes me, it grounds me. And that's so necessary as we heal, as we take action, as through our voices, through our feet, through showing up in whatever ways we can. And I want to leave it on that note and say thank you for showing up here and for showing up every day for your students, for the world, for feminism, for all the healing. Any final words you want to share?
Just gratitude. Thank you so much for having me and for all the work that you do.
Blessings. Take care. Thank you.
Today we heard about equity for women in science, some disheartening universal statistics, as well as some heartening female leadership, particularly from Cassidy Sugimoto, to hasten progress for women researching and funding progress through science on every level. I am Ren Ribeiro, and I thank you for joining. This initiative is named Mujeres Co-Labor for Peace. It's a show of intimate conversations with justice workers who are healing their self and communities from the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. This initiative is supported by Inner Fortune, the full-life self-coaching journal that is now digital. Join us for peace, and thank you for your heart.